Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Donahue, the Associate Dean here for Public Affairs and Communications, and today it is my pleasure to welcome Fred Kaplan, who is the National Security columnist at Slate Magazine and the author of a newly released book, Dark Territory: The Secret History of Cyber War. As we do when we have a book talk, we will have the book for sale and for signing after this talk out in the lobby, so I hope you all can stay for that part. Really, today's talk couldn't come at a more interesting day. I'm sure you all saw the headlines that the United States has charged hackers associated with the Iranian government with crimes with crimes for hacking into U.S. banks and a small dam in New York, which I don't really understand that part. Maybe you can explain that. Certainly, this stuff is in the headlines every day, from the Brussels attacks to understanding what we know about different terrorist organizations to that constant trade-off that we have between security and surveillance. It's an issue I think that I certainly think a lot about, and I'm sure you do too. He's originally from the Midwest. That's in your bio. Fred went to college to study literature, but after watching the Watergate hearings, changed to political science, so that was a good decision. His time at MIT allowed him to dive into the world of nuclear strategy, arms control, and military force planning, and these are the platforms on which he has built his career. His other books include The Wizards of Armageddon, 1959, Daydream Believers, and The Insurgents, David Petraeus and the Plot to Change the American Way of War, which, of course, Mr. Petraeus is an alumnus of the Woodrow Wilson School, so I actually have that one up on my bookshelf. And that book was a New York Times bestseller and a Pulitzer Prize finalist. A former Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Boston Globe, Fred has received his PhD in political science from MIT. So there's so many more things I could say about him, but I'm thrilled that he's here. I have to say that I met Fred we had a conference in Dublin. I got to invite his wife, Brooke Gladstone, from On the Media to be one of our moderators, and I was lucky enough that Fred came along and we started talking about cybersecurity, and it gave me an idea to have this event. So thank you for being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. The subtitle of my book is The Secret History of Cyber War. And when I was writing it, and I had that subtitle pretty early on, and they said, well, history, what kind of history could there be? Like 5 years? And people think that this started with Stuxnet, or maybe with the discovery of that 12-story white building on the outskirts of Shanghai. But in fact, the ideas for cyber war and cyber espionage and that sort of thing go back to the dawn of the internet itself. Excuse me, in 1967, when the ARPANET was about to roll out, that was the precursor to the internet, there was a man named Willis Ware. He was the head of the computer science department at the RAND Corporation and on the scientific advisory board of the National Security Agency. He wrote a paper. It was classified at the time. It's been declassified since. It's kind of a fascinating document. And he said, look, the thing is that when you start putting information on a network, when you have access, when you have online access, it might have been the first use of the word online access from multiple unsecured locations, you are creating inherent vulnerabilities. You will not be able to keep secrets anymore. And when I was doing my research, I went and talked with a man named Stephen Lukasik, who was the deputy director of ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Pentagon at the time, who was running this project. And I said, were you aware of Willis Ware's paper? And he goes, yeah, sure, I knew Willis. And I said, well, what'd you think about it? And he said, well, I took it to the team, and I interviewed a few people on the team, too, who confirmed the story. And they said, oh, God, don't saddle us with a security requirement, too. I mean, look how hard it was just to do what we've done. And, it's like telling the Wright brothers that the first plane had to carry 20 passengers 50 miles. Let's take this one step at a time, and, the Russians won't be able to do anything like this for decades. And it's true, it took 2.5, 3 decades, by which time whole networks and systems had grown up with no provision for security whatsoever. So I view this as sort of the bitten apple in the digital Garden of Eden. It was there, it was understood, it could be predicted from the very beginning. Now, it didn't percolate throughout the government, and in fact, computers really didn't start to become a big part of the government or society until the early 80s. And what specifically happened, and it's kind of a strange story, but it's true, is that the first weekend of June in 1983, Ronald Reagan was up at Camp David, and he's always watching movies up there. And on a Saturday night, he watched War Games. You might remember the movie War Games. Matthew Broderick plays this tech whiz teenager who unwittingly hacks into the main computer of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and thinking that he's kind of glommed onto a new online game called Global Thermonuclear War, almost sets off World War III. So back in the White House the following Wednesday, there's this big meeting, Reagan and his national security advisors, not about this, it was about something else completely different, but he can't get this movie out of his mind. And at one point, he puts down his index cards, and he says, has anybody seen this movie, War Games? Okay, it had just come out. Nobody had seen it. So he launches into this very detailed plot description. And people are kind of looking around, raising their eyebrows, wondering where the old man's going with this one. And he turns to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Bessie, and he says, General, could something like this really happen? And the general says, I'll look into that, Mr. President. And he comes back a week later and he says, Mr. President, the problem is much worse than you think. And this leads, about a year later, to the writing of the first presidential directive on computer security. And if you go look at this, it's been declassified since. It's called NSDD 145, National Security Decision Directive, or something like that, 145. It talks about things that are like out of today's papers. The computers which are growing up, they can be they're subject to electronic interception by foreign agents, by terrorists, by criminals. But then it took kind of a spin. Basically, this directive was written by the National Security Agency, which was, they know about computers and stuff. But they wrote it in a way that would have given the NSA power and to set standards for all computers in the United States, civilian, business, personal, military, government, everything. So there were some people in Congress who didn't like this. The NSA is set up for foreign intelligence. And they rewrote it in a way that gave NSA the power to secure .mil accounts, classified stuff. The Commerce Department, everything else. Well, the Commerce Department knew nothing about this. They couldn't do anything. At the time, the NSA had no interest in securing computers. If they found a hole, a gap, they weren't going to patch it. They would exploit it. So when foreign powers bought these operating systems or computers, they could hack into them. So nothing happened, basically, for another decade until real hacking started in full force. One little footnote to the War Games story, which is kind of interesting. The two guys who wrote that movie, who also later wrote a kind of an NSA movie called Snickers, they wanted to make it plausible, and they were thinking, they had talked with some hacker friend that they knew who told them about what was called war dialing, where back in the day you would set up a program to dial every phone number in an area code until and let it ring twice. If there was a modem on the other end, it would squawk. You could then go back and call that number later. That's how Matthew Broderick breaks into the NORAD computer. But they were thinking, could this really happen? I mean, that system has got to be closed. It's military. So they lived in Santa Monica. They wanted to talk to somebody. They called up Public Affairs, the RAND Corporation. They said, oh, you want to talk to Willis Ware, the guy who did that study. So they go see Willis Ware. He's this very nice guy. And he goes, oh, it's a funny thing. I wrote the software for that computer. Yeah, I know all about it. And he says, you're right. It's a closed system. But, there's always an officer who wants to work at home on the weekends. So they leave a port open. And yeah, if somebody just kind of figured out or just knew or accidentally guessed what the number was, they could get in. And then he leaned forward in his chair and he said, the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the only completely secure computer is a computer that no one can use. So that's kind of the lesson that we've all learned since. But what happened in the 90s, what really got things going was that, and I'm not going to take you through the whole book, but this part is kind of important to establish just so you know that this history goes way, way back. There was an outfit, and still is, although it's called something else, called the Air Force Information Warfare Center in San Antonio. And they were the first entity within one of the services to monitor hacking, to set up alarm systems, to be able to distinguish between nuisances and real threats. This was in the early to mid-90s. And the commander of this, a general named Ken Minahan, in about 96 became the director of the NSA. And he became the director of the NSA because William Perry, who was Secretary of Defense, said, Ken, you've got to go over there and fix things. They're lost. Because the world was turning from analog to digital, and the NSA was still focusing on phone circuits, radio signals. They weren't paying attention to digital. Nobody was. So Minahan had been trying to tell his fellow generals about the vulnerability of their systems. But you know what? Generals in the Air Force, they're fighter pilots, bomber pilots. In the Army, they're tank commanders. In the Navy, they're submarine skippers. They don't know anything about computers. They don't care about this. So he decides to set up a war game where a group of NSA hackers would penetrate as many networks in the Defense Department as they can. Now, this had to go through a lot of lawyers, obviously. And one provision they made was that they could only use commercially available equipment to do this. They couldn't sic, the NSA's top secret signals intelligence gear on an American network. So they lined it up. There were 25 NSA guys who were doing this. And they prepared for a couple of weeks, actually a couple of months, scoping out the networks, see what was going on. They allotted 2 weeks for this game. Within 4 days, they had penetrated every network in the Department of Defense, including the National Military Command Center, which is the point of communication between the President and the Secretary of Defense in wartime. Everything. And nobody even knew they were being hacked. There was one guy, there was a Marine out in the Pacific who saw something weird going on with his computer, and he just decided to unplug it from the internet. But even if more people had detected something going on, they wouldn't have known what to do about it. There were no protocols. There were no, call this guy. There was no office. There was nothing. But in the meantime, they got into the system. In some cases, they just left little Kilroy was here markers. But in other cases, they wrote phony emails. They broke into passwords. They canceled emails. They changed emails. They shut down fax lines. They shut down whole lines of command control. People knew that something was going on, but they didn't know what. So the debrief, they see what's going on. And that's when people started to get serious. Right after then, one of the first things they did was to put intrusion detection systems on the computers in the Defense Department. And what happened right away? They started detecting intrusions. So who knows how long this had been going on. And in fact, when they were doing this game, this is in 1997, these NSA hackers, when they were strolling through DoD networks, they found some French IPs in there. The French were already in our networks in 97. So first thing that happens, it was all of a sudden military networks start getting hacked into. And we were preparing some stuff with Iraq, and so they thought it might be Iraqis. And when you break into a network, you break into one, then you hop to one network, and you hop into another, and you hop into another. And this was going through some stuff in the Emirates. It turned out that these were actually 2 kids in California. And some people said, whoa, it was just 2 kids in California. And other people said, if 2 kids in California can do this, what can a nation state do? Well, within months, another thing happened. The network started to get busted into again. Military command sites, bases, but this was more sophisticated. They were poking around. They were looking for something in particular. They were staying there. And when they left, they were covering their tracks. This was very sophisticated. It turned out, to make a very long story short, that this was the Russians working through the Russian Academy of Sciences. Now, this is 97, 98. Cold War is over. Halcyon days, Clinton, Yeltsin. We were all friends then, but they were breaking into our systems. And by the way, let me back up a minute. The real context for this is that we had always been doing this. We had long been doing this. When I was doing my research, I was interviewing somebody who had been very high up in the intelligence community, and I was going over some declassified study in the 90s, listing all the ways that our systems could be vulnerable and the scenarios under which they could come under attack, computer systems. And the guy said, wait a minute, there's one thing that you need to understand about this. And so I subsequently asked everybody if this was true, and they all said yes. All these scenarios that you're reading, all these vulnerabilities that you're reading in these reports, these were things that we had been doing to other countries for a long time. And then at some point, somebody says, oh, this isn't like the Manhattan Project or anything. You don't need a campus of brilliant physicists and an atomic bomb. You need, a room full of computers and some people who had been trained to use them. What we can do to these people now, they can someday do to us. And that's when people got interested in cybersecurity. So it all kind of begins back then. It began with this one guy at the Rand Corporation who knew a lot about computers. It really got track in government with Reagan watching war games. And then real hacks started to take place in the 90s. What has happened since the 90s is actually, on the one hand, we know how to secure these things a lot better now. I mean, in the Pentagon, for example, now there are 24/7 watch hours. There are protocols of what to do. There's a whole cadre of personnel who are dedicated to this sort of thing. But at the same time, everything in not just the military, but in our society is now plugged in to computers, to computer networks. Elizabeth wondered how you hack into a dam. Well, because the dam is run by computers, which regulate the flow of water and when it stops and when it starts. You don't need to blow up a dam. If you hack into the computers that control the dam, you can flood it, you can stop it, you can manipulate it. What was Stuxnet, the most famous hacking of our time? The NSA and Israelis came up with this really incredibly elaborate bug that had to be installed by somebody slipping a thumb drive with malware into a printer that was hooked up to several computers, but it went into the Siemens server that controlled the speed with which the centrifuges were spinning in the plant at Natanz that was enriching uranium. And they also hacked into the monitoring system. There were people monitoring this, and they hacked into the data links from that. So when they're looking at the screens and looking at all the meters, it looked like everything was fine. It looked like everything was spinning at the right rate, that the flow was good. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of centrifuges would blow up or split apart. And so they thought, the Iranians thought, that this was due to faulty parts or their own incompetence. A lot of scientists were fired for no good reason. Until it got out of control and people realized what was going on, we destroyed about half of their centrifuges, probably setting back their program by 3 to 4 years. But then, this is kind of the interesting thing. For years, people who had been keen on this issue in the United States had been worried about the vulnerability of critical infrastructure, power grids, transportation, dams, banking and finance. And here we were the first power to go after critical infrastructure. This was critical infrastructure in Iran, and it was the first time that we know of that computers were used not just to hack into other computers, but to destroy physical objects. And there were debates within both the Bush and, Bush planned this, but it didn't get started until Obama. There were debates at all levels within both administrations. Is this a good idea? Might there be blowback to this? And the consensus was, yeah, there probably will be blowback, but look, this is just too tempting. This is, if it's not done this way, we're going to have a war with Iran. Israel or somebody is going to attack the nuclear power plants. This is a way to retard their nuclear program for a number of years. And so on balance, it's worth doing. That was the consensus. So 9 months later, 9 months after Stuxnet, the Iranians released something called the Shamoon virus, which was directed at Aramco, the Arab American oil company, which melted 30,000 hard drives, and just for a nice little flourish, put up on every computer screen an image of a burning American flag. So, and it was understood that this was in retaliation for Stuxnet. And where we are now is about 20 countries have militaries with a dedicated cyber unit in them. Some of them are a lot better than others. But in terms of our own situation, we're the best at doing this. We have, to come up with a metaphor, much better rocks, more agile rocks to throw at other houses. But our house is a lot glassier than any other houses. You know, everything is hooked up to these computer networks. You know, somebody did an experiment last year, you might have read about it, with a Jeep Cherokee, where they, you know, you have a modern car, it's run by computers. You know, you step on the accelerator, nothing mechanical is happening. It's all being done by computers. And somewhere in there, the computers are hooked up to a network because somebody figured out that it would be really convenient to have a network connection with the diagnostic center. So you could do online diagnostics. So you don't need to take the car into the garage. You can get it almost repaired remotely. And there are other things, like let's say you don't want to learn how to parallel park. Well, you can push a button and the car does it automatically because there are these sensors looking how far away this car is, how far away that car is, how far away the curb is, and that it commandeers the steering wheel. Well, somebody figured out how to break into all of this. And there was an experiment. A guy took a Jeep Cherokee out on the road, totally through the internet. These guys commandeered the car, turned off the brakes, turned on the brakes, sped up the accelerator, took command of the steering wheel. And this was done, one of the people doing this used to work as an analyst at the NSA's Tailored Access Operations Office, which is the black bag. It's a digital equivalent of black bag that the CIA has. It's the elite hackers within the NSA. He now has a job, by the way, doing security at Uber for their new driverless cars. I think that's good. I want a guy like this running security of driverless cars. But somebody is still going to be able to break into that driverless car. So the thing is, the message is that where we are all plugged in, the military, our entire qualitative edge is based on things that plug into computers. And now this I found out about after I finished the book. So this is like, you know, the bonus reel for the DVD. That the Navy is now training people on ships to use a sextant to navigate by the stars in case during a war the data link with the GPS satellite is hacked. That's kind of where we're going. So the NSA, I'm going to wrap up, because you probably have a lot of questions, with this one observation. All of this, the reason why very little of this is known and why people think this is a brand new thing, even though it's been going on for a long, long time, is because it's all been centered at the NSA, which, you know, the joke used to be NSA stands for no such agency. It's the largest and one of the most secretive intelligence agencies. It's also been described as a black hole. Things come in, they never come out. It's all been exceptionally secret. And, you know, the rationale for this is you know, it's reasonable. When the NSA was just in the business of making codes and breaking codes, this is incredibly secret stuff. If the enemy learns that you've broken his code, all they have to do is just change the code and you have to start all over again, right? But now, in the last few years, something has grown up called the US Cyber Command. It is a combat command. It is based at Fort Meade. It is commanded by the same four-star general or admiral who is the director of the NSA. It involves the same technology, the same personnel, the same skill sets. There used to be a distinction of computer network defense, they called it CND, computer network defense, and computer network attack, CNA. But then there was something in the middle called CNE, Computer Network Exploitation. And the idea there was, it's like espionage. You want to get inside the other guy's network, see what's going on. You exploit his vulnerabilities. Computer network exploitation. But it's like having, a spy on the ground, but this is a digital spy in the network. But the difference is that once you're in there, it's only one more step to CNA, to computer network attack. And you're already there. It's just one extra step. So it's an ambiguity. So you now have this situation where we're inside everybody's networks, they're inside our networks, and on the one hand, maybe this is just espionage, just seeing what's going on. On the other hand, it could be battlefield preparation. And if, say there's a crisis blowing up in the South China Sea, and say maybe the US and China think that a war is about to happen, and we're both penetrated in each other's networks. One side or the other is going to feel a real incentive to launch a cyber attack on those networks so that the other side has a harder time responding to the war that's about to happen. You might want to preempt the other guy before he preempts you. So you're creating a hair trigger situation. And in the context of this, you have something called US Cyber Command, which is in charge of both the defense and offensive side of this. When the atomic bomb first blew up in 1945, there were a lot of things secret about the bomb, but there were some things that were very public and very widely known. First, what it did, what it looked like, what its effects were, what it was made of. It was uranium. You knew who had uranium. You could figure out, okay, how many countries could get the bomb, how big they would be, how many there would be, and then you had people with a strategic sensibility coming up, thinking about this, like, well, how does this new weapon in our midst alter the nature of warfare? Can it be used as a weapon, just like any other weapons, or not? What kinds of steps do we have to take to make sure that this doesn't happen? And this was a wide-ranging conversation within months of the explosion of the first A-bomb. That hasn't happened with the cyber weapons. I'm not saying that they're as destructive as nuclear weapons, but they are a lot more accessible, and they can do a lot of damage, and nobody has been thinking about it because it's all been tied up in an intense secrecy of the NSA. Right now, as we speak, there is a Defense Science Board panel in the Pentagon working on a report about cyber deterrence, because nobody has ever defined cyber deterrence. What is the government's role and responsibility in deterring a cyber attack? What kind of cyber attack? An attack on one bank? Should the government care about that? 6 banks? 10 banks? A movie studio? The lights of a small Midwestern town? The lights in New York City? And then what do you do? Do you fire back in kind? Do you fire back not in kind? Nobody has thought about these things at all because the whole show has been run by mathematicians and computer geeks who don't think about policy. So that's the situation we're in. And, I'll end this with one coming back to some things about domestic surveillance, which you can ask about later. When the Snowden reports came out, the Snowden documents, and there was a commission put together by President Obama investigating whether there was abuse, and if so, what kind of reforms can be managed. And, they went in there and they found that actually the place was being run pretty much on the up and up in terms of laws. There were mistakes, but there was tremendous potential for abuse. You can get inside anything. So if you could imagine, if this stuff had been around when Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover were in power, they could have done a lot. Or, when President Trump, Attorney General Cruz, and I don't know who, NSA director, a lot of the legal constrictions are built from within, and they can be taken down from within. So after it was all over, the NSA invited one of the commissioners, this law professor named Jeff Stone, to come give a talk. What did you learn from this study? What kind of lessons did you take away? And he said, well, I'm a civil libertarian. I came into this thinking that the NSA was a rogue agency. Turns out it's not true. A lot of very good people here. You're following what your political masters want you to do. There are mistakes, but there doesn't seem to be much systematic criminality. So the American people, you deserve the American people's respect, but you don't deserve their trust. We shouldn't trust you. You have too much power. The potential for abuse is staggering, and there needs to be oversight. And I guess, really, I can't claim at the time, but in retrospect, one purpose of this book may well be to open up the history of what's been going on for a long time so that people understand the situation that they are in and can maybe do something about it. Do I have time for one more anecdote, and then I'll open it up? Where does the title come from? Dark Territory. Where does that come from? So this is my 5th book, and every time I've said, well, a title will emerge in my notes, and it never does. But this time I was going over the notes of an interview with Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense. And he was saying that, when he first became Secretary of Defense, he was getting briefed every day on how many hacks had happened the night before. And he's saying, we need to get together with the other cyber powers and lay out some rules of the road here. There are no rules. I mean, he had been in the CIA all during the Cold War. He says, even in the darkest days of the Cold War, there were rules. For example, the Americans and Russians agreed not to kill each other's spies. And that rule was followed all the time. There are no rules here. And then he said, we're wandering in dark territory. And I looked at that and I said, well, there's the title of my book. But then I Googled it just to make sure, this wasn't a euphemism for some pornographic term or something. And it turned out that it was a term of art used by the North American railroads to designate a stretch of track that was not governed by signals. And I'm thinking, wow, that's just a powerful metaphor for cyberspace. So I sent him an email and I said, did you know this? And he said, oh, sure, my grandfather was a station master on the Santa Fe Railroad for 50 years. We talked railroad terminology all the time growing up. But that is where we are. We're in a situation where we're all wandering in dark territory. There are no rules. We're all riding trains that are on that are on tracks with no signals. And if there is a collision, it's going to be a lot more damaging than if 2 freight trains run into each other. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions. Come on, just walk on down to the mic.
Magazine, Spy
That's a good one.
Spy, and your comment about the Navy training people to navigate by using sextants. Do you have a sense that in the computer network world there is even any possibility of total security? And if there isn't, then do we need more sextants?
More sextants, yeah, more sextants, please. Well, for many years, the NSA tried to get to total security. They were searching for the ultimate algorithm or the black box that was completely impenetrable. And that kind of disappeared when things like thumb drives appeared, And this Tailored Access Operations Office came up with ways to get into computers that weren't hooked up to the internet and could get into cell phones that weren't turned on and could, you can get in, look at this Apple phone. The FBI says, we can't get in there. And Apple says, oh, it's so secure, we're not going to let anybody get in there. So every hacker in the world is thinking, let me give that a try. There are companies that are in the business of finding what they call zero-day exploits, vulnerabilities in systems that nobody has found before. And it turns out that there's a small company in Israel that's made up mainly of former analysts with something called Unit 8200, which is sort of their NSA. And they said, we found a way, we found a way. So there's always going to be a way. So, yeah, But see, this realization is just now set in to people at a very high level. It's kind of too far gone to go back to the old days, you know? Do you want to go back to the old days? You know, do you want to have no internet anymore? Do you want to have, you know? So nobody wants to go there, and everything is built on it. So I'm not saying that it's useless to still keep building better locks. You know, yeah, keep building better locks and burglar alarms and, you know, big dogs barking at the door, you know, the digital equivalents of those things. But it's like when I was working on the book, friends would ask, what are you doing? And I say, you know, what you're worried about is criminals or just miscreants or just troublemakers trying to hack into your stuff and to get your bank account or your Netflix password or something. There are things you can do. There are things you can do. But if somebody really wants something that you have and they know what they're doing and they have a lot of time, and especially if they have the resources of a nation state, there's really not a whole lot you can do. So I think that's sort of the, it's a kind of a continuing arms race of offense versus defense. Every time there's been a war game, an exercise in the Pentagon where some hackers try to hack into the communications and command control system, they always get in. They always get in. So, you know, yes?
Well, architecturally, yes, I can see we're extremely vulnerable. But I think it's possible, you know, there's certain bargains we accept. We get free Gmail, and we get, you know, overloaded with advertising.
Right.
Well, it's possible to have email programs you pay for instead of free that would prevent that, that wouldn't allow that. I mean, you know, that's one small example. But do you think it's possible to develop a notion of digital trespass that, you know, that could apply? Do we have to restructure the entire internet experience, all the networks, in order to achieve that? I mean, when, you know, the trespass, you can't come into my home without my permission,
Right.
But here you come into my life through the computer.
Right. Well, you know, China has been able to do that to some extent with, but here's the problem. These things are not owned by the government. Even if the US government wanted to do this, the fiber optic lines, the networks themselves, the phone lines, these are run by private industry. There have been times, and this critical infrastructure too, these are private utility companies. There were times when this stuff first started getting discovered in the 90s. There were people in the White House in the Clinton administration who wanted to impose mandatory security standards for these kinds of companies, critical infrastructure. This was resisted by the companies themselves, by their lobbyists, and even by economic advisors and the Treasury and Commerce departments who thought, quite correctly, that this would retard research and development, that it would put American companies in poor competitive stand with foreign companies, which would not be so restricted, and so it never went anywhere. There was a proposal to create a parallel internet for critical infrastructure, which would be wired to a government agency, that if something were attacked, they could do something about it right away. Well, this leaked out, and people on Congress labeling this as Orwellian, and it was taken out. So there have been attempts to do this, but given the kind of unusual situation that we have, it isn't likely to happen. I mean, one entity that has started to do quite a lot are banks. Why? What do banks do? Banks are they want your money and they want your trust. So they're getting hacked all the time. They're going to lose. So they actually do, and they have a lot of money. So they spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year patching holes, getting things repaired. There are still hacks, but not nearly a small fraction of the number of attempted hacks. But an electrical power grid, you know, they might say, you're asking me to spend $50 million to spruce this up. I'm also getting the impression that this is going to be overridden 2 years from now, and I'll have to do it all over again. And by the way, I've done a calculation that shows if there is a hack, it doesn't cost me a whole lot more to clean up afterwards than to take these preventive measures, which might not even prevent. And so they don't do it. And nobody's making them do anything, so they don't do anything.
Thanks for your talk. I look forward to reading your book. I'm not sure I totally would agree with the characterization that nobody's thinking about the various policy, legal, military, academic implications of
Go ahead, sorry.
No, sure. Various cyber advancements today, but I do think that it's interesting that the public conversation might be so different from a private or elite one, in part because public engagement with cyber stuff as consumers is sort of purposefully structured so that you don't think about the back end, so that you're just thinking about your front end experience. So I wondered if you could speak to the implications of setting up various cyber infrastructure, ethical or legal, when the public versus the private, or maybe public versus elite understanding of these issues is so different by design.
Right, that's an interesting question. The point I was making was that there hasn't been much discussion of it because until very recently, nobody has even known the dimensions of it except for people within this very narrow community. This is beginning to some degree. I mean, for example, this thing that I mentioned earlier, zero-day exploits. In other words, coming up with vulnerabilities in systems that have not discovered before. In the past, by which I mean until a couple of years ago, this was sort of like the crown jewels of the whole enterprise. The government would pay lots of money. Well, there were people in the NSA looking for zero-day exploits all the time. Stuxnet consisted of 5 zero-day exploits. There are companies in the business of selling zero-day exploits. The more legitimate companies to the software and computer companies themselves, like, hey, we found a flaw in your source code. Here it is. Oh, thank you very much. Here's $100,000. But they also sold to government, to foreign governments, to criminals. It's a big business. And so the problem, of course, with the zero-day exploit is that, okay, good for you. The NSA has found a way, a backdoor into this operating system that's used all over the world, including by the Russians and the Chinese. If you've discovered it, that means other people have discovered it too. And so it's not even a dilemma of vulnerability of security versus civil liberties. It's security versus security. Good for you. You've discovered this so you can hack into these guys better. But that means that they can hack into our stuff too. If they haven't figured it out now, they'll figure it out at some point. So one outcome of this reform commission that Obama did was there is now a policy in place that when the government comes up with a zero-day exploit, there is a discussion, not within the NSA, but within an interagency panel within the NSC, National Security Council. And they have to ask a number of questions. How likely is it that this vulnerability will be discovered by someone else? If you do exploit it, will this affect things that are used throughout society? Or is it just something kind of narrow? Is it possible, is there any other way that you can get this intelligence? If not, is there a way to exploit this vulnerability briefly, get what you need out of it, and then patch it? And these questions all have to be answered before a zero-day exploit is approved, and it's approved by the president. So, I mean, the fact that this process exists, and to be honest, I don't know how many times it's actually gone through this process, but there is a realization now that these issues, which used to be discussed and decided on very narrow criteria by the people who were doing it, people now realize that there's dilemmas here. There's paradoxes, there's dilemmas, there's trade-offs, and people in a higher level of decision-making who are political and who are reportable, they are the ones who make the final decisions on this. So it is beginning to happen. Yes.
Hi, my name is Julie Reed. I'm an MPA 1 student here at the Woodrow Wilson School. I'm going to give myself the luxury of 2 questions since no one's behind me. The first one is, do you see any significant changes as the leadership in government shifts from people who are more digital immigrants who came to technology and technological with full respect to all the people in this room who I'm sure are excellent citizens of the digital world, to later in life, as opposed to people who have grown up using technology? Or maybe you don't see a significant change because, as she mentioned, so much of your experience as a digital consumer is about front-end experience. Prior to coming here, I worked at OMB in the Deputy Director for Management's office and weathered many cybersecurity problems there, including the OPM hack. And one of the things we often found was that it was unsophisticated methods of accessing the network that were often the most damaging, having to do with people's just general lack of awareness of basic cyber hygiene.
Right.
So that's one question is, do you see sort of a demographic shift? And then my second question is, what's the role of international organizations like NATO and the UN and the US working with international partners to develop cybersecurity or digital security norms? Because it seems that one of the big problems we have when thinking about deterrence is determining what exactly when is it cyber warfare, who gets to define that, and what are sort of the responses to that? Similar to how we have norms for other kinds of warfare attacks, nuclear deterrence, for example, how that lay out, if this happens, this happens. What's sort of the role of international organizations, and do you see any real movement in building international cyber norms?
Right. Okay. Well, the generational thing, I think, that is happening. I mean, as I said, the military had no interest in this whatsoever because they weren't into computer. I mean, when this stuff first started emerging in high-level government, in the 90s, look, President Clinton, when he was president, he never sent an email. The Secretary of Defense never used his computer. This was Obama. Both the Obama and Clinton, and I'm sorry, McCain campaigns were hacked into by the Chinese. This is well known. They hacked into all their documents. Obama was so wedded to his BlackBerry, and they told him, nope, sorry, sir, you can't use your BlackBerry because, for obvious reasons, could get hacked into. He said, look, there are a few people I have to communicate with on this. So the NSA actually built him a one-of-a-kind BlackBerry, which with special shielding, with special passwords that are updated every week. And anyway, I don't know at what cost. I tried to find out. I expect a lot. But so, yeah, that's as people, it's become now a matter of security. And so, yeah, people are more aware of it and what has to be done. They're also getting better at the offensive side of it, too. In terms of international organizations, again, Gates was saying we ought to get together with the major powers. That was when the major cyber powers were, the United States, Russia, China, Israel, France, maybe one or two others. And you can imagine a backroom deal going on with them. What about when you get into Syria, Iran, North Korea, non-state actors? What kind of thing? With China, something has begun to happen. There was an agreement, I forget the exact wording, but that we will not do a certain kind of attack, which really nobody was doing in the first place. But still, it was down there on paper. We're now at the level with China where we are discussing forums where procedures might be discussed to set up a committee to discuss possible, it's like at that level. So it is beginning, but, it's one of these things, it's not like the Congress of Vienna. It's not like the Cold War. It's spread. It might be too late. It's spread out a lot, and then how do you verify any of this stuff? And, attribution, which is less of a problem than it used to be. The idea is somebody's hacking us, but I don't know who. It's now, they've gotten better at tracing them, but it's still not a 100% solved problem. So, when China was hacking like crazy, and it would be brought up quietly in a diplomatic forum, they would say, oh, we too we will join you in the fight against hacking because we are very much against this. And you couldn't really prove that it was the Chinese government. I mean, now you can, but so it's amorphous. It's invisible. It's as traceless as the people who want to do it possibly do it. And also, are we going to give this up? As you mentioned, the OPM hack. How many millions of people's personnel records got hacked away? And there was a congressional hearing where they asked James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, they started asking him about this grievous cyber attack. And he said, well, you know, I don't know if it's a cyber attack. It's really more an act of espionage, similar to certain things that we've done as well. So nobody wants to give it up. You know, it has too many advantages to give up for the sake of maybe an unverifiable security against somebody else doing it. So it's much harder to control this than, say, to control the number of nuclear missiles, which you can count. You know, you can look at it with satellites. You can have on-site inspection. I don't know what on-site inspection of a cyber agreement would look like. You know, so it's very problematic.
Hi, I have a question. You were talking about the driverless cars earlier. We've seen a lot of adaptation of technologies like Apple Pay and things, which put a lot of vulnerable information like credit cards and stuff out there in the open for people to hack into. In terms of driverless cars, if they were hacked, that becomes a matter of life and death kind of situations. Do you see any pushback from policy people or governments that could potentially maybe like ban driverless cars, and because of the threat of now it's becoming a life danger instead of material stuff like money and that kind of thing?
Well, if it's going to be done, it should be done now before it becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry with a lot of people wanting a driverless car, you know? Personally, I see the appeal of having certain features of a car, even a driver car, be computerized. I don't know why it has to be plugged into a computer network and why it all has to be integrated like that. Why can't they be kept separate? You know, online diagnostics, nice idea. Can't that be kept completely separate from the other computerized functions of a car? You know, the guy who hacked into the car, he did it in a Jeep Cherokee because that was a car that he had a budget to afford. All cars are kind of running this way. It's quite likely that all modern cars can be hacked into. And it becomes very cool. I mean, imagine, assassinations. Drone strikes are pretty quiet. There's a drone up there, then boom. But at least with a drone, something went boom. You see, well, it must have been a drone strike here. There's a crater, But imagine a situation where, somebody commandeers the steering wheel, the brakes, the accelerator. Car smashes into a tree, investigators come along and say, well, it just looks like he lost control of the car. You don't even know that anything untoward happened. We're now in the Internet of Things. Everything is plugged in like this. Somebody I know who's been doing red team exercises for a long time, he wrote a paper about a decade ago, sort of foreseeing this. And he titled it, only semi-facetiously, Information Terrorism. Can you trust your toaster? So, it's coming down to that. Everybody wants it because it's convenient. It's cheap. Why were power grids set up on these SCADA systems, these computer-controlled systems? Because you extend the grid. If there's a power surplus here and a shortage here, you can redirect things. You don't need personnel. It happens automatically. On its own level, it makes perfect sense. And when this stuff went up, in the last quarter century, nobody was even thinking about security of this sort as a problem. It didn't even occur to the people who were designing it. Yes?
Hi, Mike Kelvington, MPA1 with the dark territory. Talked a lot about foreign threats, but there's also internal issues. So
there's also what?
Internal issues with, people who have to follow standard operating procedures because of the need for monitoring and whatnot, and also the potential impossibility of monitoring who's had access to particular things within systems. So what do you think the appropriate response should be from the government for people who decide not to follow SOPs, such as, for example, maybe keeping top secret material on a personal server?
Well, let me deal with what you're really leading up to here. I'm not a big fan of Hillary Clinton, except in comparison with everybody else that she's running against. But, you know, what was this about here? They investigated the email. So you have these guys with green eye shades who are instructed to mark anything that's classified. It's not necessarily a classified document. It's like retroactive classification. So they found 22 emails with top secret information in it. What were these things mostly? Most of them were about news reports about CIA drone strikes. Now, Defense Department drone strikes, open information. CIA drone strikes are top secret, special, compartmentalized intelligence. Even though Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA, just wrote a book which was approved by his CIA clearance officers, which has an entire chapter discussing CIA drone strikes, which if a lower level CIA officer had put these in a novel, would have been deleted, blacked out by the censors. So that's one thing. A lot of these emails talked about conversations with foreign leaders, which are inherently top secret. Now, I think, was she foolish in putting anything of any sort on a private server, especially some kind of fly-by-night operation, some guy operating out of a basement? Yeah. Were the Russians hacking into this? Probably. The logs show that there were attempts to do like standard fish baiting stuff, you know, like click this link and it applies, you know, it downloads some malware. And they trace these to Russia. There is no sign anywhere that she actually took the bait. There is no sign, and if there were a sign, I think we would have heard about it by now, of any really, really sensitive stuff being discussed in these servers. She's also not the first one. You know, this is a problem that I have as a quasi-historian. You know, if you're doing a book on the history of the Vietnam War, you can go into the archives. There's memos from Bundy to McNamara, McNamara to Rostow. You can trace the whole thing. There are rules about what you're supposed to do with hard drives and emails. They're almost impossible to enforce. Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, kept 1/3 of his emails on his private laptop at home. How are we going to know it? We might not ever know why the war in Iraq started. In terms of standard operating procedures on security, were you also asking about Snowden, or was this a Hillary Clinton question?
Well, it was a combination of both. I guess, truth in lending, I'm a major in the United States Army. So,
okay.
The level of scrutiny and how maybe Private Manning was actually held accountable, and the scale of the punishment he received, the punishment General Petraeus received, and then those that we're kind of currently explaining away right now. It seems like there's a disparity between a standardization of holding people accountable, and that exists in other aspects as well. But just wanted to
one thing about Manning, as you know, and I think the sentence was crazy, but that was in a military court. And military courts, the whole Uniform Code of Military Justice makes no pretense about fairness or justice. Somebody once wrote a book, There is no justice in military justice. No, military justice is to justice as military music is to music, is the title of the book. But the Code of Military Justice is almost entirely to impose discipline. And the idea was, if somebody does something like what Manning did, and listen, I talked with senior intelligence officials who said, no, there's really nothing terribly sensitive in it. Some embarrassments in Manning's documents, but no real serious state secrets in that one. But that's, and in fact, the judge did not throw the book at him, did not accuse him under the Espionage Act, which could have been a capital crime. But yeah, it was nuts. Petraeus, with all due respect to Princeton, I don't understand this at all. Because, it was a civilian court, but, okay, it's one thing he showed this book of very highly classified stuff to Paula Broadwell. But then he lied about it to the FBI. The FBI asked him point blank, did you show this to anybody? And his first answer was no. And I don't know, I've always been taught that it's prima facie felony time. So if I ever get the book thrown at me, I want Petraeus' lawyer to come to my rescue on that one. Calling it a misdemeanor and, slapping him on the wrist with a fine that he can well afford as Henry Kravis' partner, it doesn't quite make it. In terms of Snowden, we can talk about Snowden a little bit. I've written things. I'm kind of known in some circles as the liberal Snowden critic. To my mind, if all that he had done was to leak some document showing that NSA domestic surveillance was much wider than anybody had imagined. And by the way, I think there were some misunderstandings about why this was going on, but that's another thing. Then, I think, yeah, he broke the law, he broke his contract, but, give the guy a break. This is whistleblowing. This is legitimate whistleblowing. He's not going to escape jail time, but there was a public service here. But if you look even at the stories that came out of the Snowden leaks, he talked about, and some interviews, it talks about hacking into email accounts of Taliban in Pakistan, hacking into, or talking about CIA vetting of agents in Iran, the CIA budget, the whole CIA budget, line item by line item. A 60-page book listing all the tools and techniques that the NSA hackers use. Hacking into Chinese computers and cell phones. Whatever you think about the war in Afghanistan or these policies, this is what the NSA does. It intercepts foreign communications. And, it's one thing to say, yeah, WikiLeaks in a way is we're out to tear down the system. Okay, that's what they're doing. Snowden is the same thing. I'm a whistleblower who's bringing truth to power and, enlightening the American people as to what's being done to them. No, he's taking down an intelligence agency. A lot of this stuff fits even a broad definition of whistleblowing in no way whatsoever. And, and the fact that, I don't think that he was a spy, a Russian spy. I think he might have been manipulated by people who, for example, his travel route, I want you to look at a globe and show me what travel agent would book your flight from Hong Kong to Latin America going through Moscow. It's kind of a weird passage. And now he's he's in their clutches. He's living in an FSB building. His phone is clearly tapped. Every keystroke must be followed. And any day that he wants, Putin could just spit him out. No, again, I admire a very small portion of what Snowden did, but don't really. And again, if you are aware of some of my writings, you would know that I am critical of official policy on many things. But hey, this is what the intelligence agency does, and leaking the crown jewels secrets about this, I don't consider whistleblowing by any stretch. So if he comes back, I don't see him escaping major jail time. But I don't think he's coming back unless Putin kicks him out and he has no place else to go.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.